Let's talk a little bit about some of the paradoxes of privilege. And these are some of the things that make it difficult for people to wrap their head around privilege and to wrap their head around how they may experience privilege or may not. So one of the things, and we talked about this a little bit already, is that the way privilege is constructed makes it look like it's legit. Makes it seem like, of course it's that way. Of course this is how it works. So an example is the idea of the gender roles that we have, which is a social construction, appear to be linked to biological and genetic differences between male and female. And so it becomes a natural, of course it is this way. And it makes invisible the fact that our gender roles are actually the social construction, and that we could have gender roles constructed in very different ways that would not lead to the same kind of inequities, but we don't. So the idea that we can link it to biology and genetics makes it feel like it's very natural, makes it look like there's no real question here, also makes it look like there's nothing to be done. But really what it's doing is it's hiding the fact that we have this as a social construction. We also have an interesting phenomenon where the way people define the groups and the way people experience privilege don't stay the same. They actually change. They can, and sometimes change very quickly, as we look at what has happened over in the definitions of race over time, just in the United States. So our definitions of who is white, what counts as Black, what counts as Latinx, these have changed in the US over time, and have even changed really radically in the last 10 to 15 years. And so as those definitions change, it changes who we think of as being in the privileged group, who we confer privilege to, and who we may indeed be marginalizing or considered part of a marginalized group. And of course, we've hit on this a little bit, but to be overt about it, one of the other paradoxes is that privilege is what's often unspoken. So if we don't give something a name, we can't talk about it. If we don't have language that describes something, that names something, it gets to continue on and be perpetuated without a counter, without anyone saying anything to speak on how it is problematic. So we then have to create the words and create the language that allow us to talk about the experience people are having. So there was no thing as spousal rape. You could not rape your spouse. Well, of course, spouses were being raped, but there was no mechanism for talking about that in any legal sphere or even kind of in communities and households, because there was no name for it. And it wasn't until it began to have a name that people were able to then organize and contest that the behavior was allowed. And the other part that's really interesting about this is that we don't really get to decide on how we're going to enact, or if we are going to enact, privilege. It depends on what other people see when they see us. Their view of us can provide privilege or deny privilege, regardless of what actual category or status we have. For example, if we think about the change with the census, that then changed where Latinos could indicate not only an ethnic identity, but a racial identity. This led to a significant proportion of Latinos now identifying on the census as white. But that identity as white doesn't matter if when they walk out the door, people perceive them as an ethnic other. So there are a lot of Latinos who do appear white, who do have an experience of walking through the world as white. But even many of the ones that are on the census designated as white, that's not the way they experience their world. So the fact that other people will look at them and decide that they are an ethnic other, they will then be treated as the ethnic other. And so they don't have the privilege of this definition of whiteness, even if they are technically categorized as white. You will also see this if we think about if somebody is perceived, but then we learn that they have a mental illness. That change in an individual's perception of you, because now they know you have a mental illness, can take away the privilege that you had experienced prior to them knowing that. So it ends up being relational, and it ends up depending on what other people perceive about you. Another important privilege is you can be privileged even though you don't feel like you have privilege. And this is perhaps one of the really tricky things that happen. People who experience marginalization in another area, that experience of marginalization will often be central to them and central to the way they define their experience in their life. And it makes it difficult for them to acknowledge the privileges they may get based on another domain. One of the things where this very often will come is whites in the US who grew up in poverty will often struggle with the idea of how can I be privileged? I grew up in poverty. I grew up under these circumstances that were so difficult. I grew up with abuse and neglect. That meant you experienced marginalization based on social class, but it doesn't change that you experience privilege based on whiteness. And there may have been times where the privilege based on whiteness did very little to mitigate the oppression you experienced based on social class. But how would it have changed if you had been that poor, but now a person of color? And usually people can recognize, yeah, there would have been something different, or even be able to say, and I think in the article, my class didn't trump my race, she talks about one of the things that they knew is that as bad as they had it, at least they weren't Black. That's one of those ways where inherently people have a sense of the privilege, but they haven't ever given space to talking about it, or have been actively encouraged not to have those kinds of conversations or to think of themselves in those ways. And so they may implicitly have a sense of having racial privilege, but they don't really know what to do with that or how to talk about it. The other piece is that we can have identities that are privileged, and because it's relational, that by definition means that the privileged identities we have are directly tied to oppressions that others experience. But we are individually may not be an oppressive person. We may not intentionally engage in oppression, but that does not change that we have a privileged identity. Part of this goes into things we'll talk about throughout the year in this idea of the good bad. If I'm a racist, that means I'm bad. I'm not a bad person, therefore I can't be a racist. That's an illogical argument when you actually look at it. But because we've set up discussions around these things in such a way, it makes it easy for people to say, well, I'm a good person, so I can't be a racist. I'm a good person, so I can't experience privilege and oppress others. And that functions, one of the things I love to talk about is not so much what we're saying, but what is the function of what we're saying. And the function of that argument is to shut down conversation, accountability, reflection, and action. So we have to find a way of being able to accept and understand that we may be a good person. We may not engage in oppression. We may even engage in anti-oppression efforts, but it will not change whether or not we have that privileged identity. And it will not change whether or not we experience privilege at the price of another person's oppression. How do we get ourselves off the hook in talking about privilege and oppression? Well, one, we deny that it exists or we minimize it. Those people are whiners, they're exaggerating, it's not really that big a deal. Having a very narrow band of perspective taking, so I can see things through the lens I'm used to, and maybe I can be a real great abstract thinker in 100 other ways. But now that we're talking about this domain, my perspective has gotten very narrow and I cannot take anyone else's perspective and really take it in. The argument that people that are in the subordinate groups, those that are marginalized, arguing that they're actually doing better. They are the privileged ones, and that those with a dominant status, they are now being attacked and they are now the ones that are experiencing marginalization. So this is often what we see when we hear of the reverse discrimination claims, or people saying that all the jobs are going to those people of color. We know that that is not the case. People will even say this when they're in a room where there's one person of color and all the rest of them are white, but still being able to make this claim that they're actually doing much better because of affirmative action, because they get all the jobs. Efforts at blaming them for the experiences that they have, and this can be through perpetuating stereotypes about that group, but even sometimes it can be a little more subtle, just like, oh, if they tried a little bit harder, then they wouldn't experience da-da-da-da-da. And another way that we avoid these issues is to simply allow privilege and its beneficiaries to experience life without having to be questioned on whether it exists and whether or not they're experiencing privilege and benefits. We also will use euphemistic terms, like talking about things in a plithy, silly, minimizing way that doesn't really get at the heart of what we're talking about. So we'll hear the battle of the sexes, and we won't talk about it as gender inequity or gender oppression. We don't use the words that are more emotionally laden, but also more accurate. We stick with terms that allow it to look like it's playful banter or it's something silly. It's not a big deal. Another way we will try to get off the hook is saying, well, this is the way it is and everybody prefers it. They prefer to live in their neighborhoods and they prefer to be with their own kind. And, so everybody's happy. And some of what can be difficult about that is it could very well be true. I mean, it is often true that people want to live near other people like them, people who understand their culture and they speak their language. But no one wants to live in a neighborhood where there's high poverty, where there's high crime, where there's, constant police surveillance. So saying they prefer to live there together, if that's being used to minimize the conditions of life in different areas and to ignore the structural pieces that lead to abject poverty for some and not others, that's just another way we got off the hook. And a huge one is only wanting to pay attention to the outcomes and to holding people accountable if what they did was intentional and intentionally malicious. What this means is if somebody did something by accident, they're not held accountable. If they had a good intention or a neutral intention, they're not held accountable. This is where you get, well, I didn't mean it. It was just a joke. I was just trying to talk and learn. This is one of the only areas where we allow this to occur. We have a system where you accidentally bump into somebody's car and you're expected to leave a note with your contact information. You apologize, you give your insurance, you repair their car, even though it was an accident. So it being accidental, it being something that you intended to be helpful. The idea that if we did something out of ignorance or did something that we thought would be appreciated, but people have told us that it was harmful, then in every other context, we feel the need to take responsibility for that. Somehow, when we're talking about issues of privilege and marginalization, people want to be able to be let off the hook because they didn't mean it, because it was just a joke, because they weren't intentionally and maliciously causing harm. And this connects to this idea that we assume that you have to be a bad person and that only those bad people are the ones that are responsible for the actions or need to have an intervention. This goes back to, if I'm a good person, then I don't need to intervene. I don't need to take responsibility. So we hear, my family never owned slaves. We only came over here in 1900. Well, it doesn't change the fact that you may be a beneficiary of white privilege. It doesn't change that we're in a system that systematically will oppress certain groups and benefit others. This idea of, well, I've never called anybody a fill in the blank. So since I have never called anyone those names, I don't need to look at how I might still engage in oppression and have implicit biases and may benefit from not being in that group. And then another one, acting as if we talk about it all the time. I'm so sick and tired of hearing about how they, da, 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 da. Because the reality is we don't have this conversation often. It is an infrequent conversation. When we do have it, it's often very short. And when we have it, it's often fraught with a variety of fragilities, whether it's white fragility, male fragility, heterosexual fragility, but it's fraught with all of these fragilities that shut down conversation early and punish people for even bringing it up. So the reality is we are not having frequent overdone conversation around these issues. When we talk about social justice and we focus on reducing oppression, we need to clarify that there are indeed costs for the privilege if we want to convince a wider audience that they need to do some of this work and they need to have skin in the game. I mean, perhaps one of my favorite quotes on this topic comes from Paulo Freire. Oppressors become dehumanized in the creation and perpetuation of oppression. Because when we look at the kinds of things that happen for privileged group members, what are the prices that they pay for their privilege? We see that there is a shift in their ability and capacity for empathy towards others, that Those that are not part of their privileged group, they will tend to have less empathy and compassion for. And really, for me, a lot of this ties into the price we pay with our basic humanity, an inability to have empathy for others. We often will have to deny our own emotions. Think back to our video on empathy for Black people and talking about having to be watching this lynching and deny the emotions that we're having of horror and disgust. That's an extreme example, but that same piece happens, that people with privileged identities have to have a way of disconnecting from some of their emotion. That's part of that process of disconnecting from some of their empathy. To be a privileged person often means there's limited self-knowledge and self-awareness. Often there's a price to psychological well-being because people have increased fear, guilt, shame, and a spiritual emptiness. In order for privilege to work, we have to have some degree of isolation from those that are different from us, or those allies who are going to think differently and call us out on our nonsense. So we have to make sure that we keep ourselves at a safe distance from those that will call us out or that will lead to an awareness that we're uncomfortable with. Another price that's paid for privilege is that if we have experiences that are not associated with our privileged identity, that actually are associated with a marginalized identity, then our experience often is rendered invisible. And one of the best examples I can think of this is how men's sexual assault often goes unacknowledged and is actually associated with increased shame because sexual assault is associated as being a girl and woman problem. This is one of the ways in which the privileged group, being men, will pay a very heavy price for being in that privileged category. There's also limited understanding and knowledge of others' culture and history, but what people also don't realize is it often means that there's going to be limited understanding and knowledge of their own history and culture. This will often happen in white students when they have to do a more in-depth description of their family and their history and their culture and their language and their traditions and their foods. And I will often have students that realize they don't know any of that anymore. At some point in our country's history, their family came as immigrants. That immigrant status was initially denigrated, but over time they were deemed white. In joining that status of white, they had to get rid of and eliminate a lot of their ethnic otherness. And so now, a few generations later, they don't know their original family's language. They don't know the culture, the history, the foods, because they gave up that ethnic identity in order to have the white identity as it's defined in the US. Privileged people, similar to oppressed people, live in a society where there's increased social violence and social unrest. And because we stay divided, we have diminished capacity to engage in collection action on things that would benefit all of us. So we've covered a lot on our discussion of privilege. This is a good time to take a break. When you come back, we'll move on to individual and institutional betrayal and how we can end up transforming these into individual and institutional courage.